on the recording. Okay.
Quantity, not quantity, Johnny.
Beg your pardon, Johnny?
The quality, not the quantity.
Absolutely, absolutely. Although I was amazed at the number of people that joined the other night. We had over 70 computers at the live version, and there's been about almost 60 viewings as well. That means probably 150 people have watched that share, which is really quite remarkable. So, I mean, if we're looking for positives to take from Corona, I think the spread of knowledge and of Torah knowledge, particularly on Zoom, since Corona has been phenomenal, because I suspect that at least 3/4 of those people would not have taken part in that shiur if it weren't for Zoom. So, you know, we've got to look for positives, and there's one.
There's quite a good speaker was on, that's why I think.
What did you say, Johnny?
There's quite a good speaker was on, that's why I think.
Oh, well, that's subjective, which is where we actually left off last week, talking about subjective, the subjective qualities of the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, if you remember. Okay, so what I'm going to do to start with is we're in Sanhedrin. We're on 11b. For those who are in the hard copy Steinsaltz, it's page 57. And I'm not going to put that on the screen right now, because David and I had a WhatsApp conversation, and his interest was piqued with a QUE last week about the idea of when the year was intercalated, what time of the year it was intercalated. And we spoke about it being probably tried to be before Purim, before the 14th of Adar, because otherwise, you know, you'd end up having Purim twice and reading the Megillah twice. You'd read it on the 14th of Adar, and then if you made a leap year suddenly after that, you'd then have to have Purim again on Adar Sheni. So David looked that up and has come up with some very interesting things. So I'm going to hand over to David to start with, and he's going to spend 10 or 15 minutes going through this subject of when the year was intercalated. And then when he's finished that, we'll go back to our Gemarah itself. And if you remember where we left off in the Gemarah, was we were talking about the relative or humility or lack of humility of the various generations of Rabban Gamliel and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. That's where we left it off. And I'm going to go carry on with that once David has told us about intercalation of the year and how you can have some really peculiarities if you end up having an intercalation in a place where you, at a time when you might not expect it. So I mute myself so I don't disturb the sound. Go on, David, you're on.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Johnny, for giving me this space. It's not just last week that you pique my thought buds. It's mostly every week at every shiur, both the Tanakh shiur and the Gemarah shiur. And last week I got particularly frustrated because there was a source that should have been very, very familiar to me and familiar to a lot of you as well, which deals with this issue. And through finally finding that source and comparing it to another source that I was not familiar with at all, and I doubt whether many of you will be familiar with it either, it's led to some very, very interesting comparisons and conclusions, which will shed a lot of light on the Gemarah that we've been learning with Johnny for the last few weeks, and also the Gemarah that's coming up in the next few weeks. So let's go right back to basics to start this off. If you remember way back at the beginning, we had the Mishnah that discusses two types of intercalations. Number one, the intercalation of a month, where 3 judges are required according to the Mishnah, and there's no dispute. And secondly, the intercalation of a year, i.e. adding a second Adar, where there's a dispute. The Tanna Kama, the first opinion is that 3 judges are required. The second opinion, which I believe was Rabban Gamliel, was that we start with 3, and then because of the complexities concerned, we add another 2 and another 2 until we can get a total of 7. And that's basically where we are in the Gemarah at the moment, discussing this Mishnah. Now, over the last couple of weeks, we decided, we were discussing whether the extra month, which we'll say now is Adar Sheni, was 29 or 30 days. And as part of that discussion, we had this problem that when did the Sanhedrin proclaim the second month of Adar? When did they intercalate the year? But let's go back first of all to the initial discussion, the first part of that Mishnah, on the months themselves. And let's just review how the months were decided. We remember from the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, we know that witnesses would normally appear, starting off with the premise that the Jewish calendar is based on the lunar calendar, and therefore the months are declared when the new moon is seen. So a month would always be either 29 or 30 days. At the time before the fixed calendar, in the first half of the 4th century CE, the month would be declared by the Bet Din, by the Sanhedrin, based on witnesses coming. So on the assumption that the witnesses arrived during the day on the 29th day of the month, that day would be declared the Rosh Chodesh, the new month, and the month would therefore only have 29 days. Therefore, it was important to know it's the Sanhedrin themselves that would declare the new month. However, if no witnesses arrived on the 29th, then the 30th would automatically become the new month. So note the difference. If Rosh Chodesh is on the 29th, it's declared by witnesses. If it's on the next day, it's automatic. Now, if we take a look...
David, can I just interrupt you there? Because I'm a bit confused. If the witnesses come on the 29th, they wouldn't make the 29th Rosh Chodesh, because then you'd only have a 28-day month, because Rosh Chodesh has to be the first of the month. So surely it's if they come on the 29th.
Sorry, they would make the next day Rosh Chodesh.
Okay.
Sorry.
That makes more sense. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas if they didn't come on the 29th, then the following day would be the 30th of the month, and Rosh Chodesh would not be declared by the Sanhedrin. It would be an automatic declaration. I think I've lost you. Are you still there?
We can hear you, David. We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. I'd lost you. Now, this is significant. Whereas today's calendar, we have either a 29 or 30-day month that's fixed. So we know that, for example, Nisan always has 30 days, ER always has 29 days. And they vary. So if one month has 29, the next month has 30. Two exceptions in the modern calendar are Cheshvan and Kislev, which can have either 29 or 30. But what about Adar? So let's take the first source, Johnny, the source from Shemot Perek Yud Bet. Yud Bet. Sorry. Thank you. So this source we're all very, very familiar with, Parashat HaChodesh, Hashem speaking to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be lachem, for you, Rosh Chodashim. And which month are we talking about here? Anyone? Nisan, thanks, Johnny. And in this chapter, we're going to find all the halachot of Pesach, but this particular pasuk is very significant, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, because this is the proof from the Gemarah in Rosh Hashanah of the intercalation of the months by the Bet Din. Now, the Gemarah hasn't taught us so far what the basis is of three witnesses, a Sanhedrin of three being required to declare Rosh Chodesh. Here is the source, the first pasuk. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe ve'el Aharon. So there are two numbered there. And we know from what we've learned so far that the Sanhedrin always has to have an odd rather than an even number. So we add one to Moshe and Aharon, we get the three judges that's required by the Sanhedrin to sanctify the new moon. But maybe there's another significance in HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. What's the issue here? How many days are there in Chodesh Adar? Now, we know in our fixed calendar, when there's only 1 month of Adar, it always has 29 days. When there's an Adar Sheni, like this year, the first Adar will have 30 days, and the second Adar will only have 29 days. So to recap, a single Adar only has 29 days, and Adar Sheni also only has 29 days. Now, we discussed in the Gemarah with Johnny a couple of weeks ago, in the case of a leap year, whether it's a 29 or 30-day month that's added. And the conclusion from Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was it could be either, but that's not correct. The number actually is 29. Why is it 29? Because HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. The new moon has to be pronounced by the Bet Din, i.e. witnesses had to come on the 29th to declare that that day was Rosh Chodesh. Otherwise, if they didn't come the next day, Rosh Chodesh would be declared automatically and it wouldn't be Lachem.
So what happens if they don't come, David? What happens if they don't come?
Okay, so here's my theory, and I haven't seen it anywhere, but one of the reasons perhaps why the year was intercalated was so that Nisan would come late enough in the year so that the 29th day wouldn't be cloudy, and there was more likelihood of the witnesses seeing the new moon because it was actually there in a clear sky.
Good job they don't come and live in Manchester then, isn't it?
Yes, and as you know, the bet in sat in Jerusalem. As I said, it's a theory of mine. I haven't seen this anywhere, but it's an interesting theory. Let's look now at the question that we raised last week of when in Adar was the year intercalated. And if we look at the source in the Mishnah, Johnny, the source in Mishnah Megillah, this is what I should have known last week. Should be very, very familiar. Karuet ha-Megillah ba'Adar harishon. If they'd already read the Megillah in the first Adar, and by the way, let's date this Mishnah. We know it's got to be by the latest, the beginning of the 3rd century CE, because that's when the Mishnah was redacted. So we're talking about a time before the fixed calendar. V'nitabra hashana, and the year gets out intercalated. Korinota ba'Adar sheni. We have to read the Megillah again in Adar Sheni. Now, Johnny and I had a disagreement last week. Johnny suggested that the year had to be intercalated by Purim to stop this possibility happening. And I said no, because there is an instance, this particular instance, which proved that it did actually happen. And therefore I suggested that the year could be intercalated up until the 29th of Adar. And what I'm going to prove to you this morning is both Johnny and I are correct. So here's this Mishnah, which appears to have no practical significance to us today, but obviously had a practical significance during this era. It was therefore possible, seemingly disproving Johnny, that if if the year was intercalated later on in Adar, they had already read the Megillah and would therefore have to read it again in Adar Sheni. You with me so far?
Yeah, we're with you.
Why would they have to read it again?
They would have to read it again on the 14th of Adar Sheni.
We've already done it once. Why would they have to?
Correct.
Because they did it on the wrong day. It wasn't Purim, as it turns out.
Okay, yeah.
We like reading it on the 14th of Cheshvan. You know, this wasn't the right day.
Okay. And we've already discussed why Purim is kept in the 2nd Adar. If you remember, to compare the 2 Geulot, the redemption at the time of Haman and the redemption at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim, they should follow on 1 month after the other. It's called a concept in Gemarah in Rosh Hashanah, Geula Samuch La Geula. But I read somewhere else yesterday, there's another possible reason why in a leap year, the Megillah is read in the 2nd Adar rather than the 1st Adar. That there is a source that suggested that the year of the Purim miracle was in fact a leap year, and that the 13th of Adar, and indeed the 14th of Adar, so the 13th of Adar when the war started, and the 14th, which they kept as a Yom Tov, was actually Adar Sheni. Interesting.
Where did you see that? Where was that source, David?
I'll have to look it up again.
Interesting.
Okay. And the Mishnah continues, which again is very famous. Ein bein Adar harishon Adar sheni ela kriyat hamegillah umatanot la'evyonim. So anything that would normally be done in Adar Rishon, when it comes to a leap year, is done in Adar Sheni, which is inclusive of the mitzvot of Purim. And the Mishnah here only discusses Kriyat, Megillah, and Matanot La'avionim. It doesn't discuss the Su'udah, the other things surrounding Purim. But significantly, it also omits, but the Gemarah includes later on, the Arba Parshiot, which follow Adar Sheni instead of Adar Rishon. Now, I said before, there is no practical significance to us today living in the time of the fixed calendar. Well, in fact, there may be a slight significance that if you find an outlying community somewhere in the sticks and they don't have a rabbi and they don't have access to the internet, and we've all seen occasions where in shul a bar mitzvah boy turns up and he's learned the wrong haftarah because they didn't realize in advance that it was either Shabbat Rosh Chodesh or one of the Arba'as Parashiot, and he therefore learned the wrong haftarah. Similarly, there could be this outlying community that for whatever reason doesn't know that 5782 is a leap year. They come to the 14th of Adar, which they assume is the only Adar. They read the Megillah, and then within the next few days or weeks, they discover that in fact they'd read the Megillah on the wrong day. The halacha l'maaseh, the practical halacha today, is that in such a case, they would be required to read the Megillah again on the second Adar.
They might live in Samoa and not even know what day of the week it is.
Yes, okay. Also practical for what we were learning a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so at the moment, I've seen to have disproved Johnny and proved that the latest time for intercalating the year is indeed after Purim. But then there's another source that I found which actually supports Johnny. And it's a source in a Mishnah called Eduyot. And we'll discuss the significance of Eduyot in a second. How did I come across this Mishnah? So at the end of last week's shir, we were discussing the Nasi writing letters to the inhabitants of both Israel and the Galut in Bavel. And in fact, there's a parallel Gemarah to the Gemarah that we were learning with Johnny last week. And this parallel Gemarah was talking about the Reish Galuta, the exilarch living in Babylon, who was called Mar Ukva. And Mar Ukva had found letters that were written by the Nasi to the inhabitants of Bavel. And one of these letters was actually talking about Ibur Hashana, the intercalation of the years. And that he found a letter from Rabban Gamliel, who we were discussing last week, was writing these letters, advising the communities in Bavel and advising the Resh Galota that an extra month had been proclaimed. And therefore, this would affect when they would read the Megillah, and significantly would affect when they would observe Pesach. Now, what's the significance of this Mishnah in Eduyot and Rabban Gamliel? Eduyot is a very, very specific tractate. It's a tractate that has no Gemarah. And this Mishnah, Eduyot, it's quite a long tractate. And supposedly it was compiled on a single day, and on a single very, very fateful day for the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. And it's a day that was referred to right at the end of Johnny's shir last week. If you remember where we were at, The Gemarah was trying to prove that the rabbis of the previous generation were more humble than the rabbis of the generation of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And the proof that they brought was from this letter that Rabban Gamliel had sent to the inhabitants of the land of Israel and to the diaspora. And then the Gemarah refutes that proof and said, no, it doesn't prove that at all. This was actually written by Rabban Gamliel after he was deposed as the Nasi. Now, here's the significant...
David, can I just interrupt you there? What I'm going to do when we've finished is I'm going to go to the Gemarah in Brachot, which tells the story of how he was deposed and why he was deposed. That's going to be the next thing that we do once you've finished. So,
brilliant.
So that everybody should know, I'm going to go into that story in detail.
I was hoping that you would, and this now will give you the background to that story. It's a fascinating story. And just to give you the historical background to when this Mishnah Eduyot was composed, the actual day that Rabban Gamliel was deposed as the Nasi, and Johnny will explain to you why, the many reasons he was deposed as the Nasi. We're talking about towards the end of the 1st century CE. We know that Rabban Gamliel was the second Nasi after Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. So he took over when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai died. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we know, established Yavne in the year 70, immediately after the destruction. And at that particular time, and for the forthcoming years, the Jewish religion was at a very, very difficult position. Obviously, as the result of the destruction of the temple and the terrible decrees against the Jewish people after, the beginnings of Christianity and the effect that would have. And it left the Jewish community in despair, particularly that there were so many schisms, so many different sects amongst the Jewish people at the time, to the extent that there was even a discussion that we find in Gemarah, I think it's in Bava Metzia, as to whether the Jewish religion should be continued and that the parents should consider stopping having children in order to terminate the religion as we knew it. That was the kind of desperate state that they were in at the time. So on the day that Rabban Gamliel was deposed as being the Nasi, which Johnny will discuss why, this Mishnah Eduyot came into being. And one of the things that Mishnah Eduyot did was, first of all, discussed many of the takanot that had been rejected by Rabban Gamliel and his school. Because Rabban Gamliel, although he was a descendant of Hillel, he would personally follow a lot of the stringencies of Shammai. It's like certain rabbis today who will give their kashrut certificate, United Synagogue Bet Din or Manchester Bet Din, whatever, but they won't eat their own shechita. They'll only eat badats. They'll only eat a more strict opinion. And exactly the same thing was going on at the time of Rabban Gamliel, that although he, as the Nasi, was duty-bound to follow the rulings of Hillel, often for personal reasons, he followed the rulings of Shammai, which led to a lot of disputes. So one of the things that was decided on the day that he was deposed were issues of law where Shammai was more lenient than Hillel. Very rare, but these were all written down at the time, and you'll find these in Mishnah Eduyot. But let's look at the significance of this particular Mishnah in chapter 7 and what it has to do with the timing of the intercalation of the years. So the Mishnah there, if you look at the second part of the Mishnah, wait a minute, up a bit, Johnny. Okay, that's it. Hem heidu. Yeah, so just where you're pointing now, great. So we have two rabbis, Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Papias, who were giving lots of testimonies in Mishnah Eduyot on the day that Rabban Gamliel was deposed as the Nasi, that they gave evidence, Shem Abrin et Hashana b'chol Adar, that you could intercalate the year in the whole of Adar. Shahayu Omrim, because previously they'd said Ad HaPurim, only up until Purim. So it appears that the Mishnah that we looked at before in Megillah was referring to the later time after this Mishnah in Eduyot, whereby the year could be intercalated any time after Purim, any time during the month of Adar. Whereas Shahayu Omrim, previously they'd said, only up until Purim. And there's two reasons given why Purim was the latest date for making the intercalation. The first reason, obvious, because once they'd read the Megillah, they wouldn't want to have to read the Megillah again in the second Adar. But there's a more significant reason. We know there's a halacha in Gemarah Rosh Hashanah that one is meant to learn the halachot of a yontif 30 days. One should start learning the days of, the halachot of the yontif 30 days before that yontif. And particularly the halachot of Pesach, because of the complexities of the halachot, and significantly that if one hasn't learned the halachot of Pesach correctly, one could infringe the laws and be liable for karet, for excision from the Jewish people, because that's the punishment for eating chametz on Pesach. So what was the concern? That they'd observed Purim, the year gets intercalated then, they'd already started learning the laws of Pesach, and then suddenly they get a message that Pesach has been delayed a month because the year has been intercalated, an extra Adar has been added. Therefore, the rabbis decided on this fateful day that instead of Purim being the cut-off point, the cut-off point was now the end of Adar, because they were so concerned that people were so involved in their learning for Pesach that when the messengers came and said, no, Adar Rishon has now become Adar Sheni, so we're adding an extra month, they wouldn't believe the messengers. And they'd carry on with their 30-day learning, and they'd observe Pesach a month too early, which would involve them breaking a law, but for which the punishment was correct. So therefore, on this fateful day, the law was changed, and the year could be intercalated up until the end of Adar. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. That's amazing. And of course, the conclusion was fantastic that we were both right.
Yes.
You can't get any better than that.
Thank you,
okay.
David. Thank you, David, for
Excellent.
that.
Thank you very much.
You've got a lot of work into that.
Let's go back to our Gemarah for a second, and then we'll see how that fits in exactly with what David was saying. So let me put the Gemarah back on just for a second. Right, there we go. The Gemarah should be back on now. And so we said last week that they had these three letters, and the reason that we said that the previous generation was more humble than the other one. Let me turn that phone off. Sorry. The reason we said that was more, they were more humble, was because on one of them said, it's fitting in my eyes, and the later generation said it's fitting in my, no, sorry, the other way around. The first generation said it's fitting in my eyes and in the eyes of my colleagues, and he didn't need to say that because actually it was his decision. And the other generation said it's fitting in my eyes to make an intercalation. So and then there was the letters, and so we said, where are we?
Page before, Johnny.
There we go, right at the bottom of the page. Thank you. So concerning the declaration of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the Gemarah observes, come and see what difference there is between the earlier stern authorities and the later humble authorities. For although Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel was known as particularly humble, his proclamation was written with less modesty than that of his father, Rabban Gamliel, who David has just been talking about, who was known to be particularly stern. Now, then we went and saw these three letters that they said about the intercalation. Now, why? The question I want to ask now, let's get off that now and go back to something else. The question is, why was Rabban Gamliel considered particularly stern? Now, David has started to tell us that by explaining that he generally went along with the opinion of Shammai, who was in the vast majority of the cases more strict than Hillel in his interpretation of the law. We almost always paskin like Beit Hillel, and Rabban Gamliel himself tended to go along with Shammai. So that was, he's known to be strict, but he was also known to be very stern and rather, what's the word I'm looking for?
Didactic.
What's the word? He
didactic.
He was didactic. He ruled with an iron fist. I think that's what I want to say. He was the Nasi, and he took no prisoners. And I'm going to show you a Gemarah now in Brachot, which tells us what's going on here and what went on. So let me share that with you now. We're still doing a Gemarah share here, but we're not actually doing a Sanhedrin share right now. We're doing a Brachot share. All counts though. So here's the Gemarah in Brachot. It's 27b. And there was a discussion, it's a famous discussion, as to whether Ma'ariv, the Tfilat Arvit, the evening prayer, is obligatory or optional. We know that Shacharit, morning prayers, and Mincha, afternoon prayers, are obligatory. No discussion about that. You have to do those. There was a discussion as to whether Arvit, Mariv, was obligatory prayer or a optional prayer. That is, by the way, why I'm sure you've all wondered why there is no repetition of the Shemona Esra at Mariv, whereas there is in Shacharit and Mincha. And this is the reason, because there is an opinion that says actually Mariv is only optional. So it's not repeated. The reason it's repeated in Shacharit and Mincha are for the people who don't know how to do it themselves, and therefore they listen to the repetition of the Chazan, say Amen, and they have fulfilled their obligation. So if there is no obligation, as in the opinion that says so of Mariv, then obviously if there's no obligation, there's no need to repeat it for the ones that don't know how to do it, for them to say Amen to fulfill their obligation, because there is no obligation. So that is the reason why Mariv is not repeated. You might have thought it's because it's late and everyone wants to get home, which may also be a reason, but the real reason is that what I've just said. So this was a discussion that they were having. Is it obligatory or is it optional? And so there we go. Now it says here, Tana Rabbanan, the Maaseh b'Talmid Echad, there was a story involving one student, Sheba lifnei Rabbi Yoshua. He came before Rabbi Yoshua and he said to him, is the evening prayer optional or obligatory? And Rabbi Yoshua said to him, Reshut, it's optional. Okay, fair enough. The same student did a naughty thing and he came before Rabban Gamliel and he asked the same question. Not meant to do that. Once you've got an answer from a rabbi, you're not meant to go and ask somebody else until you get the answer that you want. If you want to do that, you need to do your research first and find out what the answer is going to be before you ask the question. The lawyers amongst us will appreciate this. I was in court yesterday remotely, and I was being grilled. I was cross-examined for 2 hours yesterday in the witness box, the virtual witness box, and I hardly answered a question other than yes or no, because the very wily barrister who was cross-examining me only asked questions to which he already knew the answers, which is what a barrister is meant to do. I did eventually manage to actually get my opinion over to him and to the judge. But the point is, they don't ask you any questions unless they already know the answer. They don't want any surprises. So if you want to get the psak from a rabbi that you want to get, you have to do your research first and know what answer you're going to get before you ask the question. What you're not allowed to do is ask the question, get an answer, don't like that answer, and then go and ask somebody else. That's not allowed, because the Mishnah says, Asei lecha rav, make for yourself a teacher, a rabbi, not lots of them. So once you've got a rabbi, that's it. You've got to stick with him. So you need to choose him carefully. Anyway, this student was a naughty boy and he didn't do that. And he went to Rabbi Yeshua and then he went to Rabban Gamliel and he said to him the same question. Is evening prayers optional or obligatory? And Rabban Gamliel, true to his usual approach, takes the strict approach and says it's obligatory. And then the student makes it all worse, causing even more trouble, because then he says to Rabban Gamliel, but hang on a minute, Rabbi Yeshua told me it's optional. And Rabban Gamliel said to the student, wait until the masters of the shields arrive, enter the study hall. Who are the masters of the shields? This was the time when halakha was being decided, really. This was the discussion panel, if you can imagine. This was the think tank, I suppose you would call it, the think tank of the halakha. So all the students come in, all the rabbis come in, and he says, wait until they come in, and then we'll see, we'll discuss the issue at that point. So they came in, when the masters of the shields entered, all the other rabbis come, the questioner stood up in the forum and says that question. He says, is it obligatory or optional? And Rabban Gamliel says it's obligatory. Now, in order to ascertain whether or not Rabbi Yeshua still maintained his position, this was Rabban Gamliel being very forceful. He says, is there anybody who disagrees with me? Bearing in mind he's the Nasi here. You've got to imagine this rather daunting experience. They've got a Nasi who's particularly renowned for a rather dictatorial, that was the word I was looking for before, by the way, a rather dictatorial approach. And he says, I think it's obligatory. Anybody want to disagree with me? It's not really an honest question, actually. However, Rabbi Yehoshua himself, who did disagree, said, no, nobody disagrees with you. Either because he didn't fancy a fight with Rabban Gamliel, or, as it says here, in deference to the Nasi, he didn't want to argue with him publicly. Either way, he said no. But then Rabban Gamliel is not leaving that alone. He's not satisfied with getting Rabbi Yeshua to agree with him in public. He's taking it further. And he says, Rabban Gamliel then says to Rabbi Yeshua, but hang on a minute. Somebody told me in your name that you hold that it's optional. I remember this is in front of everybody. This is in front of the Baalei Tristin, the masters of the shields. By the way, you notice that word, Baalei Trisin. You've all got Trisin, haven't you? Yeah?
Shutters.
Shutters, yeah. Well, and that's where the word comes from, shutters, Trisin. It's the same word. Baalei Trisin are these masters of the shields, as this translation is. They're called masters of the shields because they're shielding people from making mistakes. They're making the halacha. So they are the ones who are shielding us from the punishment of karet, for example, that David mentioned earlier. So just as a by the way, we always like to learn a bit of Hebrew in our shiurim, don't we? There's today's word is trisin, okay? Word of the day, Baalei Trisin. Anyway, so yes, Johnny.
Just whilst you're discussing one gives permission and one says no, yes and no. I read a lovely story in Rabbi Sachs's book the other day of the two rabbis are arguing, and when the Talmud got the opportunity, he says to God, how is it they're arguing? He says, but you know, what's going on? Who's right? And God says to him, they're both right. To which the Talmud then says to God, but they can't both be right. And God says, you're right. You talk about confrontation. It's a lovely story. Right.
What's very interesting is that this is public confrontation that we're discussing now. Yeah. And actually, the way that halakha works today is that in the Bet Din, they are very opposed to confrontation. And the first thing, and we've spoken about this many months ago, the first thing they tell you to do is to go away and try and make a compromise. Remember we spoke about that? There was a whole Gemarah about whether compromise was good or bad. And we had some people saying that compromise is wicked and that they should be, you know, they weren't allowed to do that. But the way it works today in the Bet Din, those of you who were at the Mavoy Satum presentation will know that from there that they're very reluctant to have any kind of decision-making process, and they push people off to go and make compromises and go and have mediation. So this, however, the Gemarah that we're learning now is not that at all. This is Rabban Gamliel, seems to me, spoiling for a fight. He's got Rabbi Yeshua to agree to him, but he's not leaving it alone. He's saying, hang on a minute, they told me that you said it was optional. Amalei Rabbi, listen to this now. This is how he came to be deposed. That's why I'm telling you this Gemara. So Amalei, Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yoshua, Yehoshua, not Rabbi Yoshua, doesn't refer to him with his title. He just says, Yoshua, Amod al raglecha, stand up, stand on your feet, v'ya'idu b'cha, and they will testify against you. Amad Rabbi Yoshua stood up, al raglav, on his feet, va'amar, and he said, Ilmalei ani chai v'hu met. If I were alive and the other person was dead, i.e. the student who split on him, who grassed him up, right? If he was dead and I was alive, the dead person could deny, I could contradict. The living person could contradict the dead person. In other words, there would be nobody here. I could say that I never said it. He says, but it's not the case. The real truth is, ani chai v'hu chai. We're both alive. So how can I contradict it? It's true. So in other words, it was a complicated way of saying, yeah, I did say that. I can't deny it, he says, because if I deny it, the other guy's going to tell me that I'm lying. If he was dead, I might be able to lie my way out of this, but he's not. So I can't. So he says, yeah, I did. So now, whilst all this is going on, look what the Gemarah says now. Haya Rabban Gamliel Yoshev v'doresh. Meanwhile, Rabban Gamliel's carry on giving this whole drosha here, sitting down. But Rabbi Yoshua omed al raglav, and Rabbi Yoshua stood on his feet like some naughty little boy in the headmaster's office. And Rabbi Yoshua was not a nobody. Rabbi Yoshua was, top guy. And because he hadn't been told he was allowed to sit down yet, he's still on his feet this whole time. And then look what happened. Ad sherinenu kol ha'am. The whole people started to get upset with this whole situation. Va'amru lechutzpit haturgamam. And they said to chutzpit, the translator, okay, the Turgaman, he was the guy that was explaining and translating the drosha. It would be like me giving a drosha, and because you don't understand my English accent, somebody would then go and say it in a different accent or a different language. They had this guy. It's interesting. We're told his name is Chutzpit, the root of which is chutzpah. I don't know how he got his name, but maybe that can be David's challenge for this week. Find out why Chutzpit was given that name, David. That's a challenge for you. Okay, anyway, so they said, Amod.
He used to mistranslate on purpose.
Maybe, Chutzpah, yeah. Anyway, they said to him, the people said to him, Amod. Stop. It doesn't mean stand on this occasion. It means, Amod, stop translating. We don't want to hear what Rabban Gamliel's got to say anymore. We're fed up with all this dictatorial approach. Look at poor Rabbi Yoshua. He stood on his feet there like a naughty boy. V'amad, and he stopped translating. And then what happened? They said, Amri, what was this murmuring? What the people there, these masters of the shield, the people who were there, they said, Ad kama netziarei v'nezil. How long is Rabban Gamliel going to give Rabbi Yoshua a hard time? Rosh Hashanah eshtaked tzarei. Last year on Rosh Hashanah, he gave him a terrible time. Tsa'ar. Can you see that word tsa'ar in there?
Pain.
Tsa'ar means pain. Tsa'ar gave him pain. He afflicted him. Translated here as afflicted him. Okay. So, and I'll come and tell you that story in a minute. Bifchorot, in the issue of the firstborn, the Maaseh de Rabbi Tzadok Tzarei, there was another incident with Rabbi Tzadok he afflicted him there. Hachanami, here also, Sa'are ta v'na'abre. He's now
Donnie,
giving...
It's Sharon. Is any of this related to Rabbi Yehoshua being so poor and so humble compared to some of these guys who are international business traders, and that he was being disrespected because of his financial humility?
Don't know. Maybe subconsciously that's what's going on here. It could be. Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yehoshua, as you can see from this Mishnah, were always in dispute with one another. And it seems from this Mishnah and from the stories, I'm going to tell you the story, the first one, at least anyway, of the Rosh Hashanah one. Rabban Gamliel was very harsh on Rabbi Yehoshua. It may well be, Sharon, that subconsciously that was, Rabban Gamliel was a wealthy man. We know that. Rabbi Yehoshua was not as wealthy, and maybe that's why he felt that he had the power to do so. Don't know. It's a good question, though. It wouldn't be out of the ordinary to suggest such a thing. It's human nature in a way. So the people are saying here also, he's giving him a hard time. Ta v'na'abre. Let's remove him. Let's depose him from his position as Nasi. The people rose up and they'd had enough of his behavior. Behaving in this dictatorial way. Let me just carry on, and so we'll see, and then I'll go back to the story of Rosh Hashanah that we just mentioned. So then they said, "Man no kimle." Okay, if we depose him, who shall we put in his place? Who's going to be the Nasi? We've got rid of. If we get rid of Rabban Gamliel, who's going to be the Nasi? Nukmeil Rabbi Yehoshua. Maybe we should put Rabbi Yehoshua in his place. And they said, nah, we can't do that. Baal Masehu, he's got a vested interest here. We can't do that. We'll be seen to be two partisan because he's part of this whole business here. He's the recipient of Rabban Gamliel's harshness. We can't make it Rabbi Yehoshua. And then they said, Nukmeil Rabbi Akiva. Maybe we should put Rabbi Akiva as the Nasi. And then we said, no, we can't do that. Dilma aneshle delet lezechut avot. We can't do that because he would be vulnerable because he doesn't have any zechut avot because he didn't come from a rabbinic fancy family.
Pedigree.
Yeah, he didn't have pedigree, he didn't have yichus, and therefore he'd be vulnerable to attack. By the way, there is a halacha that says that a ger, a convert, cannot become a dayan. I don't know if you're aware of that. A convert cannot become a dayan. There is a question as to whether a convert can be the leader of a community as well. I think that is not held so firmly, and there are instances of converts becoming leaders of communities, but you won't find, to my knowledge anyway, Geirim are becoming Dayanim because of this idea. So what did they suggest? Okay, Ela nukmele Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya. Let's make Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya the Nasi in his place, because he is, and the next bit of the Gemara, I think, Sharon, if you're still there, supports your view. And they give a reason why we should do this. Dehu Chacham, he's very wise. Dehu Ashir, and he's rich. Okay, so maybe, Sharon, that's an indication of what you were saying. Could be. I think that what I understood this before you said what you said, he was rich and therefore would not be subject to taking bribes because he doesn't need to because he's wealthy already. V'hu Asiri le'Ezra, and he's 10th generation descendant of Ezra. So therefore he's got Zechut Avot. and it makes sense that we would make him into the Nasi, because he's got all the qualities that they would do. Now,
if I recall correctly, Rabbi Yehoshua was a blacksmith, and there was some commentary even that the inside of his house was covered with sort of with schmutz or smut, and so he was really poor. And it may have been also that he needed to earn a living still, whereas these other guys didn't.
Yeah, it could well be. You may well be right, and I think it would fit in.
Yeah, what Sharon said, it comes up in the next part of this Gemarah in Brachot.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here because we're out of time, but I'm just going to, whilst we've mentioned, and I'll tell you the rest of the story next time in detail, and I'll go back to the bit that I wanted to talk about today, which is the Rosh Hashanah story, which is mentioned here. Last year that he was afflicted on Rosh Hashanah. I'm going to go back to that in some detail next week. But just since we mentioned that they established Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya as the Nasi, that's who they did make into the Nasi at the time. Where have you heard him before? Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya. You have all heard about him, and he was a particular characteristic of his that you will all know. I promise you'll all know this.
Haggadah?
Yes, Johnny, tell us the story in the Haggadah.
I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I know his name's in the Haggadah.
Okay, his name is in the Haggadah. Leon, you were also going to say that. You can tell us the story.
Yes,
then.
I said Seder night, yes.
Yes, go on. Tell us
Leon,
I don't know either.
Okay, so we say we say in the Haggadah, and the Haggadah is talking about Yitziat Mitzrayim, of course, the exodus from Egypt. That's what we do on Seder night. And the Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya is mentioned in there because he says, Harei ani keven shivim shana. I am like a man of 70 years old. And I didn't know that you had to say and mention the exodus from Egypt both in the morning and in the evening until this chap called Ben Zoma, with a mem, not a nun, don't get mixed up because that means something completely different, until Ben Zoma came along and explained to me that the Pasuk says you have to remember Yitziat Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha, all the days of your life. Yemei chayecha hayamim. If it had just said the days of your life, I would have understood that you had to say it during the day. But the fact that it says kol yemei chayecha haleilot, that it says all the days of your life, that word kol means it also includes the night. So that's the story we read in the Haggadah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya. Now, why did it say Harei ani keven shivim shana? I am like a man of 70 years old. Why does it not say I am a man of 70 years old? Why I am like a man of 70 years old? Anybody know the story? Okay, the story goes like this. When this story that we have just read in Gemarah Brachot happened, Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya, who they made into the Nasi, was who they made into the Nasi was actually 17 years old. He was a young bocha. Okay, he happened to be a genius. He also happened to be rich, and he also happened to be 10th generation from Ezra. That's what we've just said. But he was only 17 years old, and he was made into the Nasi. And the story goes that the day after he was made into the Nasi, he woke up and he had a long white beard, and he looked like he was 70 years old. Now, the story is told that happened in order that he would gain the respect of his colleagues, because if they walked in and they saw this little schnip of 17 years old who hasn't even got a beard, then they weren't going to take him seriously. Funnily enough, Rav Yuval told me a story like that happened to him a few years ago. like that. He told me just told me this last night. We were talking about Seder night, as it so happens, and he was asked when he was a young, newly sort of qualified rabbi to go and do a communal Seder somewhere, to stand in for somebody at the last minute. There was a fancy Rav somewhere doing a communal Seder in Eilat for like, hundreds of people, and he took ill at the last minute, and Rav Yuval was asked to go and stand in. Well, Rav Yuval looks about 15 today, so he probably looked about 10 then, and he said he turned up, and they said, "Where's the Rav?" We asked for a Rav, not a kid. Exactly the same story that they told about here. So anyway, Rabbi Elazar ben Azarya was a kid of 17. They made him into the Nasi. I rather think that he turned a grey overnight, because he suddenly realised that being the head of a Sanhedrin was enough to make your hair go grey. And that's why he looked 70 overnight, because it was such a difficult job. But anyway, either way, that's the story that we read in the Gemarah, in the Haggadah, that says, "I am like a man of 70 years old." That every single Cheder kid knows that story. You'll all remember the story now that I've told it you, that he turned grey overnight. That is from this Gemarah that we've just learned here. He became the head of the Sanhedrin, and overnight he looked like a man of 70 years old. I'm going to stop there, partly because we're over time, and partly because the phone keeps going, and it's the same person over and over again, so he probably wants me urgently. We'll go back next week. We'll carry on with the story of Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar, and Rabbi Yoshua, and what happened on the Rosh Hashanah the previous year, to demonstrate the rather dictatorial approach that Rabban Gamliel made. So I'll wish you a good week for the rest of the week, and I'm going to stop there and go and answer my phone.
Thank you. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, David, for your great contribution.
David as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.